The following is part of the Connecticut Experience series created by the Connecticut Humanities Council and CPTV. Together, we're exploring Connecticut's rich history and culture.
Where in the fuck did you get that?
We are no longer talking about a political issue. This is not a political issue. This is not an issue of rights. This is not a social issue. This is a dead baby. This is a dead human being.
And what are you doing with it? What are you doing with it?
This baby was attempted to be buried 3 times.
Not the church, not the state. Women must decide our fate. Not the church, not the state. Women must decide our fate. Not the church, not the state. Women must decide our fate. Not the church, not the state. Women must decide our fate. Not the church, not the state. Women must decide our fate. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Be a hero, save a whale. Save a baby, go to jail.
Pray, you'll need it. Your cause has been defeated. Pray, you'll need it. You put past the tides.
The woman's right to choose. So fuck you. Fuck that. Fuck that. It's a damn choice. It's a damn female. It's a damn female. It is a female.
What about the baby's rights? What about the baby's rights? What about the baby's rights? You're all gonna go to hell.
Go home! Go home!
Emotional involvement with abortion as a personal, moral, legal, and political issue is moving to new levels tonight. The Supreme Court's abortion decision, Roe versus Wade, today's ruling legalizing abortion. The Supreme Court today
Abortion and contraception go back thousands and thousands of years. So does the question of who shall control them.
Our attitudes about controlling human reproduction through abortion and contraception have changed radically over the centuries. So have our perceptions of the moral and ethical issues involved and how they should be resolved.
For centuries, Connecticut has been at the forefront of change in the laws and customs that affect contraception and abortion.
Connecticut is a microcosm of the history of reproductive policies and attitudes. Connecticut is a state which has undergone tremendous change in its abortion and contraception laws.
The first documented surgical abortion case in North America took place in Connecticut just 250 years ago. It's part soap opera, part ghost story.
In the spring of 1742, in the rolling hills of northeastern Connecticut, Sarah Grosvenor, a 19-year-old, found out that she was pregnant. Her lover, Amasa Sessions, was the son of a local tavern keeper and militia lieutenant. 1/3 of all couples in New England at this time conceived a child before marriage. So it wasn't unusual that Sarah had become pregnant by her lover. For reasons that we don't know, he did not want to marry Sarah. And he went to a physician in a neighboring town, a physician who had a rather shady criminal past, and purchased from him a powder, an abortifacient. By early August, Sarah had not miscarried, and Hallowell decided that he must operate.
And then the doctor, opening his satchel, took an instrument out. Then he tried to remove the child for some time in vain, putting her to the utmost distress. At last, she observed he trembled and immediately perceived a strange alteration in her body. on which she desired him to call in somebody, for she feared she was dying, and instantly swooned away.
She did not in that episode, abort. But 2 days later, when she was at home, she miscarried. Her sister and her young cousin buried the fetus in the woods, and perhaps at that moment they thought they had successfully covered up the fact that Sarah had been pregnant. But very soon, she became very sick. She had fever, delirium, convulsions. In mid-September, Sarah died.
The story was hushed up for 3 years, perhaps to save the family's reputations.
Oral tradition in Pomfret has it that the story came out because Sarah's sister was very troubled by her conscience, and that Sarah's ghost visited her sister's bedroom at night and urged her and pled with her to tell the story.
The Connecticut authorities came to Pomfret and charged Hollowell, the doctor, with abortion. He was later found guilty of the misdemeanor of abortion.
Colonial New England was governed by the common law tradition which our nation inherited from England. Under that tradition, abortion was a crime, but it was only a misdemeanor, not a felony. And only late abortions were criminalized, those which occurred after the point at which the woman was so-called quick with child.
Quickening was understood as the time when the woman felt the fetus move within her, and that could be anywhere at about 4 or 5 months. To try to abort before quickening was not a crime.
The quickening doctrine was rooted in medieval theology.
The medieval understanding, the understanding in biblical times of how pregnancy occurred, was that the sperm included a homunculus, which was a fully formed human being, just very, very small. But the homunculus was fully formed in the male sperm, and if the woman was fertile, the homunculus would grow. Basically, the medieval concern was about saving souls, and the idea was that an aborted fetus, if it had a soul, would go to hell because the soul had not been baptized. No one talked in those days about, for example, as you see now, the health of the pregnant woman. And people didn't really talk much about fetal life. People really talked much more about the protection of the soul. So even the early English common law was deeply bound up in religious understandings of the purpose of life, the purpose of life being salvation.
In English common law, though, abortion after quickening was a criminal act, but it wasn't equated with murder. What they were most concerned about was not that a fetus had been destroyed, but that Sarah Grosvenor had lost her life.
For the young people of Pomfret, Sarah's abortion raised a moral issue, but the issue was not the abortion itself.
When you examine their own language describing these events, we see that what they're most concerned about, what they're most guilty about, is their sense of that abortion was used to cover a prior sin. In this case, the sin was what they called fornication, sex before marriage. We find absent in the 18th century of discussion of abortion as being bad in and of itself. The concern is not so much about abortion per se, but that it's used as a cover-up. And that's a very different sort of discourse than the one finds in the late 19th century when people are trying to make all abortion illegal.
In 1821, Connecticut passed the first law in the country regulating abortion.
It expanded Connecticut's law against poisoning by making it against the law to use poison to induce an abortion in a woman quick with child. Like earlier common law, the Connecticut statute did not make it illegal to cause an abortion in a woman prior to quickening.
They were about making sure that women were not poisoned by quacks and making sure that doctors and herbalists and pharmacists who provided abortifacients could be held legally liable if they provided women with poisons. So the concern had nothing to do with the fetus except after quickening, but really was about a woman's life and about medicine.
But attitudes were about to shift radically under the impact of deep social changes.
The birth rate, in fact, fell dramatically throughout the 19th century. In 1800, the average American woman bore 7 children. A century later, that number was half as much.
They either used abstinence, they tried a variety of different kinds of birth control devices or drugs, many of which didn't work, and above all, they aborted.
In colonial America and probably throughout, all the way up through the 19th century, through the last century, the major form of birth control was abortion.
None of this was really talked about in public. It was coded. Mail-order houses would sell potions, various douches, and other items purportedly for feminine hygiene. In reality, these coded words referred to abortifacients, that is, chemicals that were used to cause an abortion in a woman.
As contraception and abortion became more widespread, they increasingly became a political issue.
Well, starting in the 1840s and peaking in the 1880s, there was a national campaign against birth control in general and abortion in particular. In part, this opposition to birth control and abortion represented the concern of opponents to the rising movement for increasing women's rights.
And they became concerned that what was going on was that women were trying to, and I'm using the kind of language they would use, were trying to evade their domestic responsibility. We're trying to go against the divinely ordained system in which women were supposed to be primarily wives and mothers. And people were alarmed by the decline in the birth rate, but the way they interpreted it was as if this decline in the birth rate was a plot of the women's rights movement. 19th century feminists, ironically, were also opposed to both abortion and contraception. They had an entirely different proposal for fertility control, one which I know from past experience in talking about this will be quite shocking to contemporary listeners. Their proposal for birth control was abstinence, except when a conception was desired. They were very concerned to establish the premise that that even in marriage, sex should be voluntary, which was really a new and a radical idea.
The initiative for outlawing abortions in the mid-19th century came not from religious leaders, but from the medical profession.
The medical profession got involved in the mid-1800s as it was starting to organize itself as a profession. And it was frankly rather threatened by the fact that midwives were performing a good deal of abortions, and the doctors wanted to have control over this medical procedure.
New medical knowledge had led doctors to doubt that quickening represented a significant point in the development of the fetus. Many therefore concluded that abortion before quickening should be regarded as seriously as abortion after quickening.
In 1857, Horatio Robinson Storer started what was to become a nationwide doctor-led campaign against abortion. He urged the fledgling American Medical Association to, in his words, enter an earnest and solemn protest against the unwarrantable destruction of human life. In 1859, at the annual meeting of the AMA, Storer's resolution was adopted unanimously. It urged state medical societies to pressure their legislatures to enact strict anti-abortion laws. The very next year, Connecticut became the first state in the nation to enact such a law. Among other provisions, it made it illegal for a woman to arrange an abortion, to allow one to be performed on her, or to attempt one herself. The Connecticut law became the model for laws across the United States. By the 1880s, almost every state in the Union had a strict anti-abortion law. In Connecticut, abortion would remain illegal for more than 100 years.
The 19th century campaign to regulate sexual practices reached its peak in the person of Anthony Comstock, who had grown up in a deeply religious Protestant family in New Canaan, Connecticut.
Anthony Comstock was a part and parcel of a larger movement, a social purity movement, which was very concerned and fearful of what was going on in urban America in the 19th century. And what was happening was there was an influx of immigrants, and these immigrants were out of control as far as the older Protestant America viewed them, considered them. He was concerned that the United States was going to hell, literally and figuratively. That the representatives of the devil were in the form of gambling, in the form of prostitution, alcohol, discussions of physiology, including sexuality, birth control, that all of these things, he linked them all together and they're all spinning out of control. And it was his calling, his divine calling. God had called him for a special purpose, and that was to suppress these conditions. And he went about it with great vigor and energy, and success from his point of view.
Anthony Comstock seems to me to be a man who was touched by the Holy Spirit. He experienced the higher fire, and his life was purified, and he wanted to evangelize the culture, which is very important.
Anthony Comstock viewed birth control as immoral, disgusting, and murderous, in the sense that the only time you should spill or waste your seed or come, that a man should come, to put it in the vernacular, is when he is seeking to reproduce. Otherwise, it's wrong, it's immoral, it's horrible, and who knows what life you're cutting short in the process.
In 1873, Comstock and his Societies for the Suppression of Vice successfully lobbied through Congress an anti-obscenity law generally known as the Comstock Law.
The Comstock Law was a law regulating the U.S. Postal Service, and it declared that obscene materials could not be sent through the mails. What's important here is that any materials that had anything to do with birth control were specifically designated as obscene in that law.
Comstock was appointed a special agent of the post office with the power to read, seize, and destroy anything he deemed in violation of the act. One of Comstock's critics, feminist writer Angela Haywood.
Shall we submit to the loathsome impertinence which makes Anthony Comstock inspector and supervisor of American women's wombs?
But Comstock answered his critics with vigor.
The attempt to suppress obscene literature and advertisements is likely to be successful now that it is backed by a congressional law. Already the Herald has been obliged to weed out its infamous advertisements which have brought ruin to the souls and bodies of countless human beings.
Following his national successes, Comstock organized state and regional societies to promote his vision of social purity. His New England Society for the Suppression of Vice described the impurity it was fighting.
There is a hydra-headed evil, malignant, unresting, and for the most part invisible, making the youth of the land its victims, dragging them by the thousands to mental, moral, and even physical disease and death.
Connecticut was one of the many states to respond to the purity campaign by passing its own Little Comstock Act, the most restrictive in the nation. It banned the actual use of birth control as well as its sale or distribution.
Curiously enough, the fight for the Comstock Law in 1879 was spearheaded by P.T. Barnum, the great circus impresario who happened to be a very influential state legislator. And as someone who had brought wholesome middle-class entertainment to the middle class at the time, he thought the same sort of values ought to prevail in terms of birth control. And that's one reason he fought for this law, which ended up banning the use of contraceptives in Connecticut from 1879 to 1965.
Despite the Comstock laws, more and more Americans, especially the more affluent, were using contraceptives. The chance for poor women also to have access to birth control became the crusade of New York nurse Margaret Sanger.
My preparation as a nurse awoke me to the sorrows of women. Tales were poured into my ears. A baby born dead, great relief. The death of an older child, sorrow, but again, relief of a sort. The story told 1,000 times of death from abortion and children going into institutions. I shuddered with horror as I listened to the details and studied the reasons behind them. Destitution linked with excessive childbearing. The waste of life seemed utterly senseless.
Sanger began publishing a monthly newspaper advocating birth control as a means for the emancipation of women. Letters from women across the country poured in. Dear Mrs. Sanger, I am only 34 years old and have given birth to 12 children, only 3 of them living. My husband is a good, hard-working man, but we are poor people, Mrs. Sanger, and the coffins of the last 2 are not paid for yet. Dear Mrs. Sanger, I hate to bother you, but I am desperate. I am the mother of 17 children. I can still face more pregnancies, for I'm only 35 years old. And truly, if that happens again, I know I shall be desperate enough to either try abortion or commit suicide. Sanger soon opened birth control clinics and organized the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood.
I believed it was my duty to place motherhood on a higher level than enslavement and accident. For those beliefs, I was denounced, arrested. I was in and out of police courts and higher courts. Indictments hung over my life.
Margaret Sanger was then, and she remains today, a controversial figure.
To look the whole world in the face with a go-to-hell look in the eyes. To have an ideal. To speak and act in defiance of convention.
She was imprisoned 3 or 4 times. She stuck to what she felt was right, and it brought hard days for her. She started a clinic in New York back in the teens. You know, she and her sister and a colleague, and they were all arrested after a bit and imprisoned.
As you read over the life of Margaret Sanger, you can see that she was very promiscuous. She did not keep her marriage vows. Her rage was directed against motherhood and the Catholic Church. Margaret Sanger has influenced our society perhaps more than any other single person.
Connecticut's Little Comstock statute was a natural target for the growing birth control movement.
Catherine Beach Day, Catherine Houghton Hepburn, the mother of the actress, Annie Porritt. Those 3 women in particular are really the founders of the birth control repeal movement in Connecticut.
Margaret Sanger got in touch with Mrs. Hepburn. They got together, and apparently Mrs. Hepburn took fire at this point and decided that we had to have it.
A woman ought to have some say in the number of children she has. I believe in the freedom for men and for women to determine the size of their family. Why should they have 15 children if they can only afford to take care of 2?
They had a meeting in the old Parsons Theater, downtown Hartford, to tell people about the movement. They thought they might have a small number. They had so many they had to open all the balconies.
We believe that the question as to whether or not and when a woman should have a child is not a question for the doctors to decide or for the state legislators to decide, but a question for the woman herself to decide.
The real goal of Mrs. Sanger and Mrs. Hepburn and the other Connecticut women was to be able to open public clinics so that low-income or poverty population women, often from immigrant families, would be able to get birth control advice and assistance at very low, if any, financial cost.
Doctors give it to those who can pay. It leaves out those who have to go to public clinics. But these have been closed by the enemies of birth control. The present state law is really a law against the poor.
The principal opposition from the 1923 hearing forward was from the Roman Catholic Church.
Catholic opposition was based on church doctrine as defined in an encyclical by then Pope Pius XI.
Any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin.
I think it's fair to sum up the Catholic Church's teaching at the present moment through its official documents and through the pronouncements of the popes as saying that the unitive and the procreative aspect of human intercourse must be honored whenever that action takes place, and consequently that there is something wrong whenever you try to interfere with that in an artificial way.
After repeated failures in the legislature, the Connecticut Birth Control League decided in 1935 to go ahead and open a birth control clinic in Hartford with Dr. Hilda Standish in charge.
Mrs. Hepburn was well known in the community, and she managed to get together a remarkably fine group of people to serve as sponsors for the clinic and be on the board of directors. Lawyers, doctors, ministers, and so forth.
Meeting little resistance in Hartford, the Connecticut Birth Control League opened several other clinics around the state.
And then in the fall of 1938, they again very quietly open a clinic in what is, at that time, the most Catholic city in Connecticut, Waterbury.
Priests, under the leadership of Father Eugene Krein, got together and they issued a decree to be read in all the Catholic churches.
It is the teaching of the Catholic Church that birth control
is contrary to the natural law, and is therefore immoral. We hereby publicly call the attention of the public prosecutors and demand that they investigate and, if necessary, prosecute to the full extent of the law.
And on the next Monday, the Waterbury police closed the clinic and sort of ran Margaret Sanger's friends out of town.
Two of State's Attorney Fitzgerald's detectives turned up at the clinic facilities on Field Street in downtown Waterbury and seized all of the diaphragms and other supplies that belonged to the Waterbury Birth Control Clinic.
Members of the clinic staff were arrested, and the Connecticut Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the law. The Connecticut Birth Control League decided it had no choice but to close all the clinics across the state.
During the 1940s and 50s, Connecticut, like the U.S. at large, was deadlocked between two cultures with very different attitudes toward sexuality and contraception.
Like roses and clover, and tell him that his lonesome nights are over.
When I was growing up, contraception was absolutely taboo. I remember when my brothers and sisters were born, we used to get ads from Planned Parenthood at the door when my mother was coming home from the hospital with a baby, and we were furious about that. We were Catholic, and this was something that Catholic people certainly were spiritually allergic to. It was regarded as somewhat akin to prostitution, that sex was to affirm the marriage covenant, and they knew that once contraception was socially acceptable, that it would facilitate fornication and adultery.
Before birth control was legal in Connecticut, women had to drive out of state in order to get any reliable help with family planning. In the 1950s, I was part of a ministry team in a parish, an urban parish in New Haven. I was also newly married and planning our family, and I would drive the parish van out of state in order to get help. And bit by bit, my neighbors asked to come with me, so eventually I was driving carloads over the line into Fort Chester, New York, where it was legal to have birth control prescribed.
Forsberg and others began transporting more than 2,000 patients a year from Connecticut to neighboring states for birth control services. In 1961, Connecticut Planned Parenthood decided once more to defy the state's anti-birth control law. 23 years after the last Connecticut birth control clinics were closed, they opened a new clinic in New Haven.
I was, by this time, very tired of driving to New York, so I called the clinic to see the doctor there. There was a citizen, a gentleman from West Haven, who was very upset at the opening of the clinic, who had been picketing the clinic every day that since it had opened, and kept calling the New Haven police and the mayor, saying, "Why aren't you closing this down? Why aren't you closing this clinic down?"
I think that a Planned Parenthood center is like a house of prostitution. It's against the natural law, which says marital relations are for procreation and not entertainment. I think the state law is a good law, and it should be enforced.
When it was opened up, they called a press conference, and the headlines in the Haven Register were birth control clinic opens, law to be tested, principals demand to be arrested. So they were. From our point of view, it was, you might say, an easy case. The constitutionality of the statute had been upheld in Connecticut on 5 occasions. There were 3 federal statutes which prevented the mailing, importing, or shipping of contraceptives in interstate commerce coming into the country. There were laws in 30 states on the subject. It was the law.
But the Supreme Court of the United States decided 7-2 to overturn the Connecticut statute. Justice William O. Douglas wrote the majority opinion.
We deal with a right of privacy older than the Bill of Rights, older than our political parties, older than our school system. Marriage is a coming together for better or worse, hopefully enduring and intimate to the degree of being sacred.
Just half a century after Margaret Sanger's 1915 prosecution, the last legal prohibition of contraception in the United States was removed.
Griswold involved a Connecticut statute which banned the use of contraceptives. It's a wholly bizarre and imaginary case.
The Griswold decision has been criticized by former judge and Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork, who was a professor at Yale Law School at the time.
None of us knew the law existed until the lawsuit was brought. It was a test case about a law that was never enforced. So that it was simply a desire to have the court make a cultural statement, which it did.
Justice Bork didn't know what Connecticut was about when he was criticizing the cases, and he may have been living there, but he obviously lived in a world where his wife could go off to a doctor and get contraceptive care. He didn't know what the real world was about.
Justice Douglas, who wrote the majority opinion, said that if you look at the Constitution, it protects various aspects of privacy. The Fourth Amendment about unreasonable searches and seizures in your home by the police protects an aspect of privacy. The First Amendment, when it protects religious freedom, protects an aspect of privacy. Therefore, he said, gee, there must be a general right of privacy, which is not mentioned in any of the explicit provisions of the Constitution. We find there's a general right of privacy. We find this statute violates that right of privacy and struck it down.
The trouble with Griswold for a lot of its critics is that the court was unable to point to very much either in the precedents, that is the previously decided Supreme Court cases, or in the Constitution itself, or in the history of the 14th Amendment to explain why this right existed. And to critics like Judge Bork and others, this is a fatal flaw.
Well, the fact is there is nothing in the Constitution that remotely bears on sexuality, that remotely bears on contraception, either way, that remotely bears upon sexual morals, either way, that remotely bears upon abortion, either way. Those are subjects the Constitution is silent about and leaves to the moral choice of the American people through legislation.
The word privacy, in quotes, is not to be found in the U.S. Constitution, as some critics of the decision have noted. It's sort of part of the fabric of the Constitution. It wouldn't be something you'd put into a Constitution because you assumed that was no business of the state. I mean, if you're going to have rights retained by the people, certainly the right to just be able to live your own life was sort of the basic one.
Advocates of contraceptive rights saw the Griswold decision as an historical achievement.
The Griswold decision was a capstone to 40 years of activism, starting with Margaret Sanger and Katharine Hepburn and the untold number of women who had agitated against the law.
Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! You know I need someone. Help!
In the 1960s, contraception became a right. But abortion remained illegal under Connecticut's 1860 statute.
Free our districts, free ourselves, power to all women.
For the most part, abortions were performed by medical people in non-medical settings. They were performed with coat hangers. They were performed with all sorts of desperate means. Women who tried to self-induce abortions.
But the ban on legal abortion began to be attacked by two of the groups who had most strongly supported it a century before, doctors and feminists.
American physicians began calling for a liberalization of the very abortion laws that their professional ancestors had worked so hard to achieve a century earlier. And interestingly, Connecticut again was a leader in this movement, which swept the nation, but in a direction exactly opposite to that of the 1860 anti-abortion law. Perhaps the 1950s emphasis on equality had something to do with it, because increasingly it became very well known that well-to-do women could afford an abortion and the poor could not. Whatever the reason, by 1967, a poll of physicians indicated that 87% favored some liberalization of the current anti-abortion laws.
Interestingly, of course, it was the medical profession itself that played a major role in making abortion legal again. And we still have this generation of physicians now, although they are getting older, who keep reminding us why they did that, how many infected and dying women they treated when they called Saturday nights the Saturday night massacres, because so many women would come in with the results of illegal abortions.
I hope, too, that we've put an end to the idea that this is not a political issue. It is a political issue. We are the means of production, and the state means to control our bodies. We produce the soldiers, we produce the workers, and they fear the loss of that control.
There's something happening here.
I first became aware of it in a way individually because I myself desperately needed an abortion and was in the position of terror and fear and all the emotions that came when that was illegal or not easily available. But it wasn't until many years later when, as a reporter, I went to cover an abortion hearing, and it was the first time in my life that I've ever heard women stand up, or I had ever heard women stand up in public and tell the truth. And as women told what it was like to have to get an illegal abortion, other women stood up in the audience and told their stories, tears streaming down their faces. It was an incredibly moving experience, and it was the basic lesson of feminism, which is we only learn the truth when we share the truth, when we tell the true stories of our own lives.
Stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
In Connecticut, an underground railroad for women seeking abortions was started by members of the local clergy.
In the earliest years, the only legal clinics and doctors that we had as places to refer women were outside of the country. Puerto Rico, England, Japan. They were all places where abortion was legal. Once we began using medical facilities within the United States, giving women the option of going to some place that was illegal, then we had to instruct them even more fully. If you're on the second floor, you need to look and see if you can possibly get out a window, whether or not it would be safe. You need to figure all the ways possible in case, for any reason, the place is raided. It was very cloak and daggerish and very demeaning for women and frightening.
In 1971, I was asked by a group of women attorneys to become one of the attorneys for a lawsuit to challenge the Connecticut abortion statute. And at the time, the idea was, because of Griswold establishing a right to privacy, that the present Connecticut statute would be unconstitutional.
And it was to be all women. And we decided very early on that there'd only be women lawyers. There weren't many of us in those days, but we got a group together. and there were to be only women witnesses, doctors, and social workers, and so forth. And there was going to be testimony. I mean, this is something that I felt very strongly about, that if you're going to translate into things that were meaningful to what was essentially an all-male court system, that you had to have people testifying about what abortion was and what it meant to women.
We had women testifying about, you know, all the horrors they had gone through, all of the difficulties, you know, going to foreign countries, botched abortions, and they got on the stand and testified. I mean, they did not get any kind of anonymity. I mean, they went on the line with their careers, their reputations, sometimes their marriages.
We ended up with somewhere between 1,600 and 1,800 plaintiffs, and there was a sense of vitality and participation in that case that I have never seen in any other lawsuit I've been in, I think.
They won in the Connecticut courts, but the state then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where challenges to abortion laws from all over the country were pending. One of them, the now famous Roe versus Wade, was brought by young women lawyers from Texas who based their case largely on the Griswold birth control decision.
Finding Griswold was exciting. Griswold obviously was a case where the state had made it illegal to use birth control. And there was a line in the opinion that said the right of privacy. And it was almost like a feeling of celebration when I found those words.
This is NBC Nightly News.
The court said in a 7-2 decision that in the first 3 months of pregnancy, only the woman and her physician may decide whether she may have an abortion. In the second 3 months, all the state may do is regulate abortion procedures. And only in the final 3 months of pregnancy can the state forbid abortion.
Well, it means that January 22nd, 1973 will stand out as one of the great days for freedom and free choice. This allows a woman free choice as whether or not to remain pregnant. This is extraordinary.
How many millions of children prior to their birth will never live to see the light of day because of the shocking action of the majority of the United States Supreme Court today? Whatever their legal rationale, 7 men have made a tragic utilitarian judgment regarding who shall live and who shall die.
The majority decision in Roe v. Wade was based on the right of privacy doctrine first stated by the court in the Griswold case.
Roe is one of the worst decisions of this century, maybe the worst decision of this century, absolutely supported by nothing. And they ought to turn it back to the political process.
There are those people who say there is no right of privacy. And there are others who said what the people writing the Constitution were trying to do is keep government out of our most personal aspects. And so there is a difference of opinion. I think Bork is wrong.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Be a hero, save a whale. Save a baby, go to jail.
I basically became concerned when the Supreme Court rendered the Roe v. Wade decision on January 22nd, 1973. Virtually all 50 states had laws on the books to protect the life of the unborn child, with the rare exceptions. And it was hard to believe that all of a sudden in our society it was okay to destroy an unborn child. There were about 3 or 4 of us women who were pretty much, you know, again, we were all about the same age, young mothers, who thought that we should try to do something in our own state to change what was happening and to start finding other people who shared our concerns, and that's how Pro-Life Council of Connecticut became an organization. Our real objectives, and mine always has been from day one, was to get our laws back into place that are going to protect the unborn child. I really thought a few years and we're going to turn this thing around.
But in fact, for the next 2 decades, abortion remained a deeply divisive issue in Connecticut and throughout the country as a whole.
Move off to the side of the street or you will be arrested.
Basic biology tells us when life begins. It was outrageous for the High Court to skirt around that issue and leave it up to the philosophers and theologians. Life begins at the moment of conception. It's when each and every one of our lives began. It's as simple as that. that's the beginning of life.
Reproductive freedom as a basic human right, that is the right to decide when and whether to have children. Some part of that, of reproductive freedom, has been the basis of every women's movement since time immemorial in every country, in every culture. Reproductive freedom is a basic human right, like freedom of speech. We can't leave this basic right up to the whim of passing bodies of state legislatures.
Ladies and gentlemen, Webster.
In 1989, Connecticut, once again, was at the forefront of conflict over who shall control human reproduction. The U.S. Supreme Court, in the Webster decision, let states put new conditions on the right to abortion.
Today's ruling is the most significant since Roe versus Wade, the decision 16 years ago legalizing abortion. And while today's decision did not reverse that, it did return to the states more authority to determine who gets an abortion and under what circumstances.
Pro-life!
Opponents of abortion saw an opportunity. In 1990, they proposed bills in Connecticut and 40 other states to regulate abortion.
The bills that we were concerned with, that we wanted to see included in legislation, was number one, that women who are contemplating abortion be adequately informed of the risk involved in the procedure as well as the alternative choices. The second was a parental rights bill. The third was a father's rights bill. The other bill that we were very concerned about was the protection of the unborn child, at least at the point of viability.
Abortion rights advocates pulled together a coalition of 60 groups to draft legislation.
After Webster was decided, I became very alarmed that very possibly the court might overturn Roe v. Wade, and essentially Connecticut women would be totally unprotected. Indeed, we had at the time on our books a criminal statute that would have been in effect and would have criminalized anyone who either had an abortion or who sought one or who provided one.
But what we do here and what we say here and the vote that we put up on that board becomes part of the history of the state of Connecticut.
The legislature's Judiciary Committee produced a bill with something for each side.
The Connecticut statute worked a remarkable compromise. It gave everybody something. To one side, it gave the right to safe medical abortion on demand. To the other side, it gave the right to restrict abortion after viability, after about the 24th week of pregnancy. In that instance, only women whose lives or safety are at risk can obtain abortions. It also gave the right of teenage abortion to women of Connecticut, but it limited it in a certain way. Only abortions which are preceded by counseling are permitted.
To the astonishment of many, the legislature passed this Connecticut compromise with the support of more than 9/10 of each house, while it had the enthusiastic support of abortion rights advocates. It was not opposed by the Catholic Church or the Pro-Life Council of Connecticut.
The victory was that people began to talk to each other. The victory on both sides was only they began to discuss issues they disagreed with each other, understood each other, and open dialogue with each other. And that was the victory. And it is, I think, a classical political decision, not a theological decision. And it's not it's not trying to be victorious. It's a classic American pragmatic view of resolving a difficult issue.
Throughout history, the rules and beliefs governing human reproduction have changed repeatedly. Abortion and contraception went from being widely accepted in the 18th century to completely outlawed in the 19th century. In the 20th century, contraception again became widely accepted. Abortion became legal, but remained controversial.
Not the state, women must decide our fate. Not the church, not the state, women must decide our fate. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Be a hero, save a whale, save a baby, go to jail.
Such deeply divisive issues can challenge the stability, even the survival, of a democratic society. Can we reconcile our conflicting moral certainties with our need to live together as members of one society?
The United States started with a deep moral conflict, slavery, that resulted in a great civil war that caused more American casualties than all other American wars put together. We've also confronted diametrically opposite moral convictions about alcohol that led to prohibition in Connecticut in the 1850s as well as the 1920s. Issues like abortion that seem finally settled only arise again many decades later. Few of our bitter controversies are ever quietly put to rest.